In this video, we're going to dig deeper into conditionals, and in fact, we're going to put a conditional inside of another conditional. Let's look at the sample code in front of us. On line 1, we set a variable called ABC to hold the value of 50. We then begin a conditional statement on line 2, which says, if ABC is greater than 25, then execute all the code from here down to the end statement on line 7. Yes, there is also an end statement on line 6, but we will get to that in a moment. So now we are within this first conditional. We will execute the code on line 3, which would print the number 1 to the terminal. And then on line 4, we begin another conditional statement. Having an if statement inside of another if statement is also sometimes referred to as nested ifs, similar to those Russian nesting dolls, where you could put one doll inside of another doll. Similarly here, we have an if statement inside of another if statement, but that's perfectly legal and valid. So line 4 says, if ABC is greater than 45. Now ABC is greater than 45 because it's actually 50. So we will execute the code between here and the end statement on line 6. Now there's only one line of code between this if and the end on line 6, which is line 5, which would print the number 2 to the terminal. So let's go ahead and run this code. And indeed, we get the numbers 1 and 2 in the terminal. So the main takeaway of this lesson is going to be that there's nothing wrong with putting an if statement inside of another if statement. It can be done, and sometimes it is appropriate to do so depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Now I'd like to make note of one particular thing here. That is that we have two if statements. We have one within the other. I like to refer to the first if statement as the outer if statement, and the if statement beginning on line 4 as the inner if statement. So we have an inner if statement that is within the outer if statement. Now we must also take special note of the two end statements that we have here. So the end statement on line 6 is actually the closure for the inner if statement that begins on line 4, while the end statement on line 7 is the closure for the outer if statement which begins on line 2. Also note the indentation here. Since the inner if statement is within the outer if statement, we indent it 2 spaces to the right to indicate that it is within the outer conditional. But also make special note of line 5. Since the command of P2 is within the inner if statement, it actually gets indented yet another 2 spaces to the right to indicate that this is the code that will be executed as part of the inner conditional. Now the inner conditional is already 2 spaces to the right because that is the code that is executed as part of the outer conditional. Now, let's go ahead and change line 4 to say, if ABC is greater than 55, what would happen when we run this code? Now let's take it from the top, and this time we're going to use Peter Jang notation. So the first line of code that gets run is line 1, where we set the ABC variable to be 50. We then will run line 2, which is the first outer conditional, which says if ABC is greater than 25. Now since ABC is greater than 25, it's 50. That means we are going to execute the whole block of code within this conditional, which is lines 3 to 6. So the next line of code that gets run is line 3, which prints the number 1 to the terminal. And then we begin the inner conditional on line 4, which says if ABC is greater than 55. So this is the 4th line of code to get run. Now, ABC is actually not greater than 55 because it's only 50. So therefore we skip to the end statement that corresponds to this if statement. So since we're dealing right now with the inner conditional, that means we skip to the inner end statement, which is the end statement on line 6. So the next line of code that gets run is line 6. It is the 5th line of code that gets run. And then finally, we conclude with the end statement for our outer if statement. Thus, line 7 is the 6th line of code to get run. So if we hit play, we should only get the number 1 in the terminal, and that's exactly what happens. Now I'm going to throw in another code sample, which we will analyze using the Peter Jang notation. So I'm going to clear that out, and here is a new code sample. Let's analyze it one line at a time and predict what will happen. So the first line of code that gets run is the first line in which we create an XYZ variable that holds the number 50. We then move on to line 2, which begins our conditional. If XYZ is less than 25. Now XYZ is actually not less than 25, right? Because it's 50. We therefore skip down to the end statement that corresponds with this if statement and that is the outer end statement on line 7. So the third line of code that gets run is line 7. And thus nothing should get printed to the terminal. Let's hit the play button. And indeed, nothing does get printed to the terminal. Even though we have lots of interesting lines of code, lines 3, 4, 5, and 6, but we just skip right over that whole thing because XYZ is not less than 25. Now, even though we have a line of code on line 4 that says if XYZ is 50, and XYZ indeed is 50, it doesn't matter. Because since all of lines 3 through 6 are within this outer conditional, since we did not meet that condition, because XYZ is not less than 25, it's actually greater than 25, so we end up skipping lines 3, 4, 5, and 6 altogether. We just skip right over them. We don't even need to look at what they say. So we always need to be cognizant of where we're at in regards to our code when it comes to conditionals. Always look very carefully to see whether a condition gets met. If it doesn't get met, that means that we're going to be skipping over lines of code. Now, while at first some of this may seem confusing, trust me that the more you work with it and practice, this will actually all become second nature rather quickly.